Hello, this is Jen from Old Tinkerer Studio. Welcome to the 4th tutorial of the Blender Basics tutorial series. In this tutorial, we will be looking at textures in Blender. Textures can add realism to the materials used on objects in Blender. We're going to begin by adding a simple texture to help understand the process of texturing in Blender. Make sure the cube is selected and then open the Materials panel. Let's change the diffuse color to a light blue. This will give us a solid color, but if we want something richer, we need to use a texture. Let's open the Textures panel, which looks like a little checkerboard. At the top of the panel, we see that we have slots for multiple textures. For now, we are going to stick with the default texture. Type allows us to choose the type of texture we want to apply. We have a choice of using anything from clouds to wood, or even our own environment map or image or movie. Each of these types have their own parameters and customizability. Let's choose marble from the list. If we go into rendered view, we see that the texture is already applied to our cube. The fuchsia color comes from the influence section. This color can be changed if we wish, but we will just leave it on the default. The texture is acting like an alpha channel. The fuchsia color is showing up where the white is located on the texture, and the original blue is showing up where the black is located on the texture. If you notice under the influence section, color is checked. Influence by default affects the color. If we turn the color off, notice that the texture is hidden. If we turn the color back on and change the influence to 0.5, the texture is affecting the color, but only at half strength. And if we change it back to 1, the texture is affecting the color at full strength. Emit affects the value of the shade and makes itself illuminate where it is white and keeps the standard color where it is black. If we check emit and turn the color off, this becomes very evident. We can also affect specular, just like we have already seen earlier. Geometry can also be affected in this section. If we turn on normal, we notice that the texture becomes a normal map. If we turn off emit and turn color back on, this becomes even more evident. The normal map creates bumps on the surface of the cube. Blend determines how the texture blends to the original diffuse color. We have multiple options, with mix being the default. If you're familiar with Photoshop or a similar program, some of these options will be familiar. If we go back to the Materials panel, we will now notice that the texture is being applied to our original material. Now let's look at how to use image maps as part of a texture. Let's go back to the Texture tab and remove the marble texture from the cube. Now we do not have any textures on the cube. Click on the second slot and hit the New button, and change the type to Image or Movie. In the Image section, we need to click on Open and open up a bitmap. In this case, I'm going to be using a polka dot pattern, which can be found on public domain pictures. There'll be a link in the description. The texture is now applied to the cube, but it is stretched. This is part of the problem of trying to wrap a 2D texture around a 3D object. What we need to do is map the 2D texture to the 3D model. and this can be done under the mapping section. If we change the coordinates to object, we can now see that the stretching has been fixed. We must realize though that depending upon the object, the coordinates option may need to be set to UV or to one of the other options. Another way to texture an object is via the UV editor. Let's delete the texture from the cube by clicking on the X next to the texture. Then click New and add a new image or movie. And I'm going to be using a vintage pattern. And this is also found on public domain pictures, and there'll be a link in the description. Let's split the screen into two vertical areas and change the right-hand side to the UV image editor. Make sure the cube is selected. Now tab into Edit Mode. And make sure that you are in orthographic mode, which is 5 on the numpad. We need to make seams on the cube so we can unwrap the cube onto the UV map. Use the shortcut Control-Tab and make sure that you are in edge mode. We need to choose the top front edge and the C-shaped edges on the two sides using Shift right click. Once all 7 edges are selected, use the shortcut Control-E to access the Edges menu and then select Mark Seam. Now hit the A key twice to make sure that the cube is selected. Now hit the U key and choose Unwrap. If the unwrapping is crooked, you can use the R key for rotation and the G key to move the UV and make it straight. Now click on the folder and open up the image. Tab back into object mode and select the lamp and turn it into a Hemi. Now we will have better lighting. Now tab back into edit mode and choose rendered. We can now see that the texture is mapped onto the cube. The pattern is pretty large, and if we want a simple, quick way of making the pattern smaller, we can make the actual UV of the cube larger. If we hit the S key, we can resize the UV. And if you look in the rendered cube, you can now see that the pattern is smaller. We can also make normal maps that will allow us to create the illusion of a rough surface. Let's start with a clean scene by going to File, New, Reload Startup File. Make sure the cube is selected and go into the Materials tab. And let's just put a light brown diffuse color on the cube. Go into the Texture tab and choose the first slot in the texture stack. And change the type to Stucky. Now when we go into rendered mode, we can see that there are stripes going around the cube. Now let's make a normal map out of this flat stucky texture. Under the Influence section, turn on Normal under the Geometry section. And now we see bumpy stripes going around the cube in rendered mode. Note that normal maps work best on objects that are high poly, meaning that they have a lot of geometry. Normal maps make the object appear to have a bumpy surface, but they don't actually change the surface of the object. If we want to actually change the surface of the object, we need to use a displacement map. Let's start with a clean scene by going to File, New, Reload Startup File. Make sure the cube is selected and tab into Edit mode. If we are going to use the displacement map, we need to have enough geometry to make it work. Go to the Tools panel and click on Subdivide, and then change the number of cuts to 15. Let's go to the Materials tab and add a light yellow diffuse color to the cube. Then under the Texture tab, let's change the default texture to clouds. If we then go to the Influence section, under Geometry, we need to turn on the Displace option. Now if we go into rendered mode, we can see that the cube's geometry has been changed. Remember that normal maps is a surface effect, which doesn't change the actual geometry of the object. Displacement maps, however, change the actual geometry of the object. Another way to create textures for objects in Blender is to use the node editor. Let's start with a clean scene by going to File, New, Reload Startup File. Let's then split our view into two separate horizontal areas. Let's change the top area into a node editor. What we want is to add a texture to the cube, so we need to change to the texture option, which looks like a checkerboard pattern. And then click Use Nodes. We now see two nodes, one for texture and the other for output. These nodes are actually connected to the texture panel that we've been using. If we go to the texture panel, we notice that the same red and white checkerboard pattern shown in the nodes is listed there as well. If we go into rendered view, we see that the texture is actually applied to the cube via the output node. We can also add nodes and make changes to the textures. Let's make sure the checker node is active by right-clicking on it, and then let's delete it. Notice that our cube is now dark because there is no texture attached to the output node. If we click on Add and Textures, you notice that we have the same textures that we have already seen earlier. We also have patterns available to us. Let's go ahead and choose bricks from the pattern menu. Now all we need to do is left click and connect the color output from the bricks node to the color input of the output node. Notice that we can now see the pattern on the cube. We can change the color of the bricks and we can also change the mortar. And we can change the thickness of the mortar as well. We can also do things like add a texture to the pattern. Let's go to Add, Texture, Stucky. Now all we need to do is left click and connect the color output from the Stucky node and connect it to the Brick 1 input in the Bricks node. Notice how we can now see a texture and pattern on the cube. So as you can see, there are a lot of possibilities here. You can certainly plug nodes into other nodes, so it's a really great way to create highly custom textures and materials. This concludes the Blender Textures tutorial. Next week we will learn about lighting in Blender.